Welcome to Biology Made Easy. In this lesson, we are discussing food chains, how to construct food chains, and then the characteristics of food chains. Well, if you look at the habitat we have there or ecosystem, you can imagine that there are so many organisms in there. You have plants, you have grass, you can have grasshoppers, you can have millipedes, you can have centipedes, you can have snakes, birds, all of them in that habitat. And so these organisms in the habitat, they will be interacting, so they have relationships. So there are relationships in the habitat. Some of the relationships are mating, that's reproductive relationships. There will also be competition amongst them, jostling for space, etc. There also can be feeding relationships. And feeding relationships in the ecosystem or the habitat, there are two major feeding relationships: food chains and food webs. In this lesson, we will discuss food chains. Well, just hearing a food chain means that we can have food connected. So we have a chain of food, and the food chain, this food and that food, means it's really an organism. So the food chain is a chain of organisms that serve as food. And you know food is energy. And so this chain of food, which is actually chain of organisms that are linked, there is energy being passed on from one to another, because food is energy. So let us define a food chain. I have a chain of food. I have a hibiscus plant here, caterpillar, toad, snake. Chain of food. So the food chain is a linear feeding relationship in an ecosystem. So this is the linear feeding relationship where energy in the form of food is transferred from the producer, which is the plant, and the energy is transferred from the producer through a series of consumers, this consumer, this consumer, this consumer. With each stage of consumer, this stage of consumer feeding on the preceding stage, so this consumer feeds on this stage, and this consumer provides food for the succeeding stage. That is a food chain. So in this food chain, I have this as a producer, the hibiscus plant. It's also autotroph. I have this caterpillar as the primary consumer. This is primary, secondary, tertiary. So primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. And if you look at the characteristics of the food chain, we have the producers, which is green plants or algae or phytoplankton in the sea. You have diatoms, euglena, organisms in water, microscopic. Then you can have cyanobacteria and purple sulfur bacteria. Producers are photosynthetic autotroph. Autotrophs are organisms that can manufacture their own food and known as autotrophs. Now, we have these examples of autotrophs. Primary consumers are herbivores. They consume plants, matter. So you have herbivores. Or if in water, you can have herbivores, you have zooplankton that occupy primary consumers. They feed on plants. And then you can also have organisms that are said to be omnivores, like man. They feed on both plant matter and animal matter. So these are the occupants. So the secondary consumers, you can have carnivores or omnivores. Omnivores can be here. They can feed on plants, or they can feed on animals and plants. So you can have omnivores also here. Then tertiary consumers, you can have carnivores. And the secondary consumers, you can have smaller carnivores, and tertiary consumers, bigger carnivores that will feed on these secondary consumer carnivores that are smaller. Then we also have trophic or feeding levels in the food chain. These producers are the first feeding level, the first level that food is taken. Then here will be the second feeding level, which is the second feeding or trophic level. Then we will have third trophic level, and you can have the fourth trophic level. Then we'll talk about the energy. The source of energy is sunlight. That's the first thing to take note. Source is sunlight. And then the energy reduces along the chain. And the energy reduces along the chain because energy is lost at each level. So the chain cannot be too long because energy is lost along the chain, and the organisms that have most energy decomposes. This we will discuss in another lesson. Numbers of organisms decreases along the chain. Numbers of organisms decreases along the chain because the energy decreases along the chain. The size of organism increases along the chain because the organism is a carnivore and usually a predator. So this brings us to the end of our lesson on food chain. Please give us your likes, subscribe, leave your comments, and thank you very much. Goodbye.